In this presentation, we're going to talk about negative reinforcement in autism spectrum disorders. The objectives: to define and describe instrumental conditioning foundations, operative conditioning and the 4 types of reinforcement, to define how neuromechanisms of negative reinforcement in children and adolescents with ASD are rewarded atypical reward processing, and to describe how atypical responding to negative reinforcement contributes to social motivational deficits in this population. The topic of this discussion is from the article Neuromechanisms of Negative Reinforcement in Children and Adolescents with Autism Spectrum Disorders. First, we're going to define instrumental conditioning foundations. It is a method of learning that employs rewards and punishment for behavior. Through operative conditioning, an association is made between the behavior and a consequence which is either negative or positive for that behavior. First, we'll start with operative conditioning. It is a type of learning in which behavior is influenced by consequences, and we'll look at some examples. In this first example, the animal or individual must operate on the environment before a consequence can occur. For example, this mouse, it pulls the lever down and it gets either a green light or a red light. On the green light, it receives a pellet as a reward. On the red light, it receives an electric shock. Rewards introduced to increase a behavior, and punishment is introduced to decrease a behavior. The end results are rats learn to press the lever when the green light is on to avoid the red light. Now we're going to talk about reinforcers of the operative conditioning. The first one is a primary reinforcer that consists of reinforcing stimuli that satisfies basic motivational needs. The second reinforcer consists of reinforcing stimuli that acquire their value through learning. We have 4 types of reinforcers. First is positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. First, we're going to start with positive reinforcement, and I'll give you an example of each one. Positive reinforcement is the strengthening of behavior after potential reinforces such as praise, money, or nourishment that follows that behavior. An example for this is something is added, which is positive, to increase the behavior, which is the reinforcement. And the example I gave here was the student has a good grade, which is good behavior, and in return she gets a treat. It's an added treat to increase the good behavior, and the behavior keeps coming. It increases the behavior, which is positive reinforcement. The second one is positive punishment. It is a process in which a behavior decreases because it adds or increases a particular stimulus. And an example of this would be a child touches a hot stove, which is the behavior, and feels the pain, which is the aversive stimulus, which means something is added, which is positive, to decrease the behavior for the punishment. It's called positive punishment. The child will know not to touch the stove the next time, which is the punishment, which is positive because it's not going to be burned. Next, we'll talk about negative reinforcement. This involves the strengthening of a behavior because it removes or diminishes a stimulus. And an example of this would be something is taken away, which is negative, to increase a behavior, which is the reinforcement. In this example is drying wet hands. Wet hands is before, that would be, the behavior would be rubbing your hands in the towel, and the after effect, water is gone from your hands. So something is taken away, which would be your wet hands, that's the negative. To increase the behavior is rubbing your hands in a towel, which makes the water go. So your future behavior will rub hands in a towel when they are wet. You will know to do that. That's negative reinforcement. Next is negative punishment. This occurs when a behavior decreases because it diminishes of a particular stimulus. An example of this would be 2 children fighting over a toy, and the mother takes away the toy from both children. Something is taken away, which is negative, to decrease a behavior, which is the punishment. In return, the children will not do this behavior again, will not act out in this manner. Next, I have an example video that I want to share with you, and that's going to be an example of human experience with some of the negative example that we was talking about. According to Cockrell and Dunlop, the authors in the article, Neural Mechanisms of Negative Reinforcement in Children and Adolescents with Autism Spectrum Disorders, are characterized by deficits in social interaction and communication, as well as restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. Core social symptoms are related to impaired social motivation, which leads to hyper-responsiveness to social rewards, which causes individuals with ASD to decline opportunities for engaging in social learning throughout development. Now we're going to watch the video that is an example of atypical reward processing.
Hello everyone, the example that I would like to share today for this discussion board post is negative reinforcement. We actually use this type of negative reinforcement for a student that I work with at the school where I work for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. So what it was we had a student who had limited fine motor skills, but also needed a lot of feeding therapy. So for him, using proper utensils for various types of food, so for example, using a spoon to eat yogurt or using a fork to eat pasta was very, very aversive. So when we first started our intervention, the highest form of reinforcement for the student to use his fork or spoon was actually to have the fork or spoon removed. So with the, we would start basically by saying, okay, you need to take one bite of your pasta with your fork, and then you can eat it in the way that you choose. That was gradually built up into 2 bites, 3 bites, 4 bites with the fork, until our student was eating entire meals with the appropriate utensil. So it almost served not only as negative reinforcement, but almost like a systematic desensitization to using the fork or the spoon, depending on what the meal was. Once we got to the point where the student was completing an entire meal using the appropriate utensil, there was then additional positive reinforcement in the form of whatever edible or tangible or even just activity the student wanted. So for example, if he had identified that he wanted to earn a small dessert after the completion of his meal, that was the one that was provided. Certain toys were very reinforcing for the student, particularly music toys. So again, this is a form of positive reinforcement because something was being added to his environment upon the completion of the desired behavior, which was to eat a meal with the entire meal with the appropriate utensil.
So as you see, the atypical reward processing started there. Previous research has found evidence for atypical reward processing in ASD for social rewards. This research focused on positive social reinforcement, while little is known about the processing of negative reinforcement in individuals with ASD. The next slide will explain more about atypical reward processing and negative reinforcement in ASD. There's 2 case studies. Study 1, colleagues found that children and adolescents with ASD showed different psychological responses when anticipating possible non-social negative reinforcement, and reported evidence that individuals with ASD and high levels of anxiety may be motivated to avoid negative reinforcement. Study 2, when examining electropsychological responses to non-social negative reinforcement in ASD, No groups differences was found for negativity. The ERP component was correlated with the age in the ASD group, as younger children with ASD demonstrated more attenuated responses to negative reinforcement. Study 2 examined neural responses to social negative reinforcement, which is a face displaying negative effects, and I have a picture at the top of my screen here that shows each one. That's non-social negative reinforcement, which is the monetary loss in children with ASD relative to typically developing children using MRI images. The results of this is the researchers found that children with ASD demonstrated hypoactivation of the right caudate nucleus and expected non-social negative reinforcement and hypoactivation, while expected social negative reinforcement. In addition to that, activation of the right caudate nucleus during non-social negative reinforcement was associated with individual differences in social motivation. The conclusion is these results suggest that atypical responding to negative reinforcement in children with ASD may contribute to social motivational deficits in this population. And this is my image resources and my other resources that I found the URLs from. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and found it helpful. Thank you.